Greetings. Did Africans sell Africans into slavery? This is a question fraught with much misunderstanding. There is really no short answer to that question. There's context that must be associated with or involved when answering that question. To simply say, as Black Americans do today, oh, they sold us. Or as Europeans like to say, in arguments or disagreements with folks, particularly online, oh, Africans sold themselves into slavery. These statements are, again, misinforming, and they are misleading. It tends to make you think or feel that there is justification for the conditions African people and their descendants find themselves in today. That is their fault. When Europeans say Africans sold Africans into slavery, it's an attempt by them to absolve themselves, their ancestors particularly, of the responsibility for the crimes they committed against humanity. When you hear Black Americans say this, they're attempting to distance themselves due to the large, gross exaggeration of anti-Blackness and self-hate that have accumulated within their consciousness from being raised here in the United States of America and in the Western Hemisphere. This question can be addressed, and in fact, this question can be answered, not with a simple yes. And as in previous videos, I would encourage you to do more study for yourselves, because again, this topic is one that is extensive and requires a lot of digging, researching, and understanding. It requires one to reconcile with history. It is important to understand that whenever you deal with issues of the past, when you're re-examining historical occurrences, that you should view those events through the actions of those who were forced to live them. In looking at our ancestors, it is important to understand that they weren't slaves, that our ancestors were enslaved, and this was a particular condition of circumstances. In looking at slavery itself, we must understand that slavery was ubiquitous in the ancient world. The Mayas, the Incas, the Aztec had slavery. Ancient Babylon, India, all throughout Asia, even Japan. You look back and look at Genghis Khan, who was notorious for enslaving people, then his Mongol Empire. Let's not forget that there was slavery in Arabia, in the Arabian empires, and Arabs were really relentless, going across Africa, enslaving Europeans. They enslaved tens and thousands of Europeans. Arabs swept across Africa in a vicious horde, enslaving, pillaging, and killing, massacring African people. Slavery wasn't only prevalent in Africa, it was prevalent all throughout the ancient world. And when considering this, those of us who consider ourselves to be righteous and God-fearing people, you should ask yourself, what does your religion say about slavery? Does your religion condemn slavery or enslavement? The truth of the matter is, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity have in their scriptures, their holy scriptures, edicts and mandates on how to treat their slaves. The famous prophet of Christianity, Jesus Christ, never spoke out against or condemned slavery in any sense. When you look at this, you must ask yourself, if slavery is this terrible institution as it is, why didn't any of the prophets or any of the religions speak out against it? And again, why are we holding Africa to a standard we don't hold other nations and principalities to? Let's look at ancient Rome. Ancient Rome was a society flooded and filled with slaves. Slavery was actually a class status in ancient Rome. Women found themselves one step above enslavement because they couldn't be citizens in ancient Rome. However, they could give birth to citizens. So again, slavery is a complex topic. And it's not as easy as just saying, oh, Africans sold Africans and you sold yourself. It's much more complex than that. And going back to the religion, I would like to read a quote from the Bible from Ephesians, the 6th chapter, verse 9, where it says, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but like slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart." The Quran, Surah verse 24, verse 32, is a chapter or verse dealing with how one should treat their slaves, particularly when it comes to marrying them off. And you all know about Genesis chapter 9, verse 25, where it said, "Cursed be Canaan." This is mistakenly called the curse of Ham, but actually it said, "Cursed be Canaan." And this particular scripture deals with blackness. This is the alleged scripture where the Jewish rabbis and Christian ministers used to justify enslaving African people, because Ham and Canaan, due to this curse, the curse was black skin, big lips, nappy hair, and elongated genitals. This is their writing. This is their interpretation. It's not mine. This is what the book says. This is rabbinic Jewish culture. This is ancient Christianity from the book of Genesis, which is the Torah. So we must understand that when saying or making the claim that Africans sold Africans, is much deeper than that. And looking at Africans selling Africans, who were these Africans? Did Africans participate in enslaving other Africans? Yes, but it's not that simple. To say that Africans enslaved each other without the consideration of the impact or how Europeans instigated the trade is something else altogether. For instance, this quote here from the Gifts of Africa: "The Portuguese took the noses of slain warriors as trophies, and not just one or two, but hundreds, while after another battle, the bodies covered the ground so widely that Portuguese soldiers were forced to step on top of them to cross." That quote is from the Gifts of Africa by Jeff Pierce. We must understand that Europeans, when they arrived to Africa in the year 1444, that the beach wasn't littered with signs and advertisements. Hey, we have Negroes for sale. We have blacks for sale. You know, Europeans came to the west coast of Africa. They were looking for spices. They were looking for gold. And they were also in search of the mythical legend of Prester John. However, Bishop Bartholomew de las Casas made the claim that Africans, one African, his work, his labor is worth that of 4 Indians. So Europeans came to Africa intentionally looking for bodies. They created the market for it, because you have to ask yourself the question: if there weren't any sellers, would there have been any buyers? And if there weren't any buyers, would there have been any sellers? Europeans came into the continent of Africa on a relentless mission to enslave African people. They came into Africa instigating rivalries between different groups and factions of African people, because again, a lot of those enslaved were war captives. They were prisoners of war. The Europeans came in slaughtering, killing, massacring African people. In fact, I would like to read another quote by Pope Nicholas V. And he wrote this to the Portuguese King Alfonso V. And this is what he had to say: "To invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use for profit." This was the European attitude. In fact, the Europeans were so greedy that they began to fight amongst themselves. And as Dr. John Henry Clark and Dr. Yosef Ben Yochanan, they would tell us about the papal bulls that were issued, whereby the Pope told Spain and Portugal, as Christian nations, to stop fighting among themselves, that they were hereby commissioned to reduce to servitude all infidel peoples because they were outside the grace of God. So we must understand that the trade itself was a horrific thing in and of itself, but this was something instigated by European greed, started by Arabs. Arabs are the ones who institutionalized this form of chattel slavery, but the European internationalized it. And I would also like to make a correction. We should not refer to it as a trade. This was not a trade. This was what we should call the European enslavement of African people, or we could refer, as Hunter Adams called it, the Trans-Oceanic Enslavement of African people. This is bigger than Africans being brought to the Western Hemisphere. So we should understand this. And these Africans who were helping the Europeans, who were they just? Who were these Africans who were so willing to help Africans slave other Africans? It wasn't kings and chiefs who were on the take, because that backfired in almost every instance. However, we must look at the mulattoes and the bastard sons of the Arabs, who were more loyal to their fathers and their fathers' endeavors than they were to their own kith and kin on their matrilineal side, their matriarchal side. We have to look at the mulattoes. In fact, there was a famous mulatto by the name of Edward Barter who became rich from enslaving and selling African people. They were some of the most competent slave traders. In fact, I have a quote from the book Sins of Our Fathers by James Pope Hennessy, wherein he says, "Some of the most efficient slave traders of African blood were mulattoes, and like the ostentatious Edward Barter of Cape Coast, could read and write and might, to inspire added confidence, even profess to be Christians." So not only did we have the Europeans on their relentless search and pursuit for bodies of kidnapping, but a lot of the Africans going into the hinterland and to the interior of the continent were not only Africans from different ethnic groups, but they were also Africans, half blacks. They were mulattoes, half white and half black, and they were half Arab and half black. And again, these half Arabs even today don't consider themselves to be African. They consider themselves to be Arab. So we must understand how dangerous this is and how important it is for us to understand everything in its proper context. And in closing, one major consideration to be taken with this topic is the fact that there was much African resistance as it pertains to enslavement. Africans didn't just sit back and allow themselves to be taken. There were many furious great battles fought by different ethnic groups, such as the Dola, the Kru, the Baga, the Balanta, even some of the Ashanti in different groups among the Oyo Kingdom, the Yoruba Kingdom. They fought relentlessly, even though there were kingdoms who participated in enslaving. A lot of kingdoms began and a lot of different ethnic groups began to fight relentlessly to preserve their lives. And some of the most ferocious battles weren't just on land. They also occurred on sea. There is one report of a Muslim imam from Senegal who refused to take any gifts or payment or compensation from the French for bodies. He refused to sell bodies. Take, for instance, Queen Nzinga of Angola, whereby she decided to fight against this horrific crime against humanity. For over 29 years, she fought against the enslavement of her people. So we must understand that Africans didn't just sit by quietly and allow this to occur. You know the history of Ya Santiwa. She also fought relentlessly to prevent her people from being enslaved. Nana Prempeh was exiled. He was another who fought with the intent of trying to prevent his people from being enslaved. And you know about the famous King Alfonso I, who was originally Nzinga Mbembe of the Congo. In the year 1506, he became Alfonso I. He converted to Christianity, began to wear European clothes. There were nuns there to teach him all the proper European etiquette, not only him, but his high court as well. 20 years later, he wrote a letter to the Portuguese ruler, and he claimed that, hey, this must stop. Our country is almost depopulated. They're taking our children, the children of our dignitaries. This must stop. Of course, it fell on deaf ears because the Portuguese needed to acquire bodies to accumulate wealth. So let's understand that Did Africans sell themselves into slavery, or did they sell other Africans? Of course. But this wasn't something that was distinctly common. This wasn't an act that pertained only to Africa. This is a common instance in the ancient world. We're not saying this should be excused. I'm only saying this should be understood, because in the common time today, there is still human bondage. Arabs are still enslaving Africans. You have the international human trafficking ring going on right now, with points of entry and points in a country where women are being snatched here in America as well, for sex and for body parts, human organs. So you still have human trafficking that exists today, but we should stop and cease with using empty phrases, empty cliches to pass off the blame because we may suffer from some delusions of self-hate, or because we want to absolve ourselves of the crimes that our ancestors caused or created and provoked in the past to enrich themselves. Because remember, this is the one single event in recent history that's changed the world, changed the scope of life on 3 major continents. And it caused Europe to become the powerhouses that it is today. And they're still over in Africa, plundering, stealing, and enriching themselves. Take for note what's going on with the Gabon and other countries in Africa right now, ridding themselves of French colonialism, which is the byproduct of enslavement. Please leave a comment, press subscribe. If you have any comments, leave them below. And until the next time, peace and blessings.